From the hidden secrets of our backyards to the realities of the third world, we take a raw and real look into the challenges and the pursuits of social justice. Welcome to The Point.
The Point podcast is brought to you by LaPointe.life, offering healthcare, entrepreneurship, and education both domestically and internationally. Visit LaPointe.life to find out how you can get involved.
Whether you're a communications director at a nonprofit or simply going on a trip to Belize, the ethics of photography pertain to us all. Today, Neal joins us in discussing the 4 C's of ethical storytelling. Lauren is an international photographer and copywriter who's worked in the nonprofit sector for over a decade. After spending years in Haiti working with a local NGO, she witnessed firsthand the trauma, corruption, and complexities of exploited orphan care systems within international aid. Since then, she's found deep purpose in documenting various dynamics of family in its many different shapes and forms near and far. Thank you, Lauren, so much for being here, and thank you for taking the time to talk with us today about ethical storytelling.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be having this conversation with you.
Yes, and Lauren is a good friend of mine. We've known each other for quite a few years now. We originally met in Haiti and had the pleasure of working together for quite some time. And ethical storytelling, I know we did an episode about it last season on this podcast, and I'll link that as well. But it's definitely new vocabulary that's being used. And so hopefully Lauren can help us kind of unpack that. But before we get to that, we'd love to hear the story about what got you into this space in the first place.
Yeah. So like you said, we met in Haiti, and my career with photography began in Haiti. I actually, prior to moving there in 2013, had never had a DSLR camera. And I figured that when I was moving there, I should probably document my experience. So I bought a Canon 7D for all the photo geeks out there like myself, and the Nifty 50. And that's kind of where it began. I just was so gravitated toward the vibrancy of Haiti. And as you are well aware, it's just such a rich culture, so many colors. The people are beautiful, both internally and externally. And it honestly was a great place to learn. I was able to shoot with a handful of Haitian photographers, which was a really unique experience. And I think that opened my eyes to this other side of international photography. I think it's really easy for us as Americans to go into countries and assume we know best. But the reality of my experience was that I actually learned alongside of people more talented than myself. So that was really unique.
Mm-hmm. And what took you to Haiti in the first place?
Well, a classic faith-based mission trip in 2007. I was in high school, and I'm sure many people have similar experiences when traveling abroad. It changed my life, and I really can't even remember what life was like pre-Haiti, but I went on multiple short-term trips, and then after college, moved and lived there for 4 years.
Wow, that's incredible. What were some of the differences you noticed from originally your short-term trips and then living there long-term?
That's an excellent question. I feel like when you go on a week-long trip, well, you're just seeing the surface level of life anywhere. But I think what I took away most from living there was you just begin to understand the cultural nuances. And once you can speak the language, then you really understand what's going on behind closed doors, what's going on in conversation when you are in a non-English speaking country. I mean, I can't tell you how many times once I learned to speak Creole that I realized many people were talking about me. And so it was fun, to join in and play along. But yeah, I think just having a better understanding of the culture as a whole is a game changer between visiting somewhere and living there.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything you wish you would have known? So I always call in that naivety, for lack of a better term, that you wish you would have known during those short-term trips?
So much. I was very naive. And it was also a time when social media wasn't what it is now. And I just regret many things I posted, many things I wrote. There is this like one picture in general that I actually still have on Facebook to humble me, because I was on a trip in, I don't remember, 2011 maybe, there for the summer. And I have this photo on Facebook. It's me holding a Haitian child in my arms. Another is wrapped around my legs. And I captioned it, "Never underestimate the value of a hug." And I look at that and I just cringe, because I'm just like, who was that? So I've made many mistakes. I was very naive as well. There's so much I wish I had known prior to, but we learn along the way.
Yeah, we definitely do. And so what are some of the things you learned, and then how does that pertain to ethical storytelling?
Yeah. So I think now that I have learned all of these things, and because we have so much more access now with the internet, I feel such a responsibility to share with others those mistakes I made, so that people are not continuing to make mistakes, in the future. And so I think one of the biggest things for me was just the exploitation that goes on within missions, within foreign aid. There's such a disconnect between foreigners and nationals living in country. And a lot of times those nationals are exploited for, marketing purposes. If somebody has an organization on the ground in Haiti and they're constantly bringing in foreigners who have no cultural context to the situation, it can be very exploitive. And I think that's probably the biggest thing I took away, not only with photography, but just the way we present these stories in general. Because in reality, those of us who travel, we are each storytellers in a sense. We all have a camera, we all have words to share.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
That we're all storytellers. That's interesting to think about.
Mm-hmm. Especially with the advancement of the iPhone. It's like the cameras are incredible. And anyone who goes on a short-term trip anywhere they have their camera with them. And so just being a good steward of that.
Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? How do we be good stewards of that?
Yeah. So I've thought a lot about this over the years, and I kind of came down to, I guess, 4 very practical ways that people can, whether you're a professional photographer or you are just a visitor, we all have a responsibility to do well and to be ethical when we are traveling. And so I have kind of broken it down into 4 different tips. Number 1, first and most important, is to have a cultural understanding and awareness of wherever you're traveling to. There are, specifically to Haiti, there are so many books available that have just such rich resources, and again, I think social media can be such an incredible tool for researching prior to a trip. There are so many social media accounts now on Instagram that portray the beauty of Haiti and that advocate for tourism. And so just being aware of the place you're stepping into is incredibly important, because you want to make sure that when you come back to your home country, like, you're sharing those stories from a place that is non-exploitive. And then I think too, consent is huge. When you are photographing someone, whether it's with, again, your iPhone or your camera, it's a little easier to do this in Haiti because people are very honest. And if they don't want their picture taken, they will make you aware of that. And I don't blame them, because, after the earthquake in 2010, so many people, so many foreigners came to Haiti and just blasted photos everywhere on the media. And it's like, I try and think about myself. If I am not having a great day, if I'm not looking my best, I'm probably not going to want my picture taken and then posted on social media without consent. And so just making sure that the person that you are photographing is aware of the fact, and also that they're aware of where that photograph is going.
Yeah, that's a great point. And especially after the earthquake, I mean, people literally were living outside. So that let's consider outside at that time their home. You would never walk into like, I mean, me and Ken Annan were talking about this and we used Austin, Texas randomly as an example, but you never walk into, somebody's home in Austin, Texas and just start photographing them without speaking to them, without saying anything and then leave and then creepily just post pictures of a stranger in their home, like with children.
Right. Exactly. And, you even think about in the context of wedding photography, for example, when the meal comes out, when dinner is served, that's when you put your camera down because we don't really want to be taking photos of people as they're eating. Those people are not going to be wanting those photos shared, I'm sure, with the bride and groom. And so even thinking of it that way, because you do see a lot of times in marketing materials, people eating food to kind of advocate for food programs or whatever. And I think just being aware of just those sensitivities and that it's vulnerable. So, and then, so cultural awareness, consent, compensation for me is huge. I, at first, might not have thought this was so important, but making sure you're paying your photographer, if it's an organization, hiring someone, whether a foreigner or a national, making sure that photographer is being compensated. I, mentioned that I got to work with some Haitian photographers. In those situations, I also got to work with Haitian models and remembering that every creative deserves to be valued for their art, for their profession. So, making sure that those models are being compensated, making sure the photographer, everyone involved in the creative process. I think it's really easy in developing countries to just assume that because maybe an organization's budget is lower, that a photographer is willing to do that work for free. Whatever the budget is, it's incredibly important that that photographer knows that he or she is valued. And, I especially want to speak to foreign photographers who go into countries and do work for free, because that is just very devaluing to the national photographers who are working in their home country. So, if I were to go into Haiti and offer my services for free, well, that's like a slap in the face to those photographers who are trying to make a living in Haiti doing the same thing. So seeing it less as perhaps a charitable act and more as, no, this is a business, and deserves to be treated as such. Compensation is very passionate about it. And I think going off of that is the community aspect. So connecting with local photographers wherever you're traveling to is huge. I think just cultivating that community so there's not so much of a disconnect between foreigners and locals. And again, that's where that compensation piece comes in. So, just recently, I actually reached out to a Haitian friend of mine who's a photographer, and I asked her what her going rates are, because I want to be fair, and I want to make sure that we're all working toward the same goal. And there's so much talent out there. And so I think just fostering that sense of community, and it's, let's say somebody's traveling to a country they've never been to. It's so easy to find community now on Instagram or wherever. Like you just look up a hashtag and I'm certain that you can find at least one local creative photographer, whoever it might be.
That's so helpful. Is there a specific story of somebody you met or something you experienced, maybe something somebody said to you that really kind of shifted that mindset for you to say like, hey, wait a second, like maybe we're not doing marketing ethically?
Yeah, there's one story in particular that is burned into my memory. And I was working with a group of kids, teenagers in Haiti, and there was a visiting marketing team from the States. Basically, they were engaging with these kids and doing some marketing campaigns for a fundraiser that they had coming up. And so this team of foreigners was introduced to the teenagers and kids as the marketing team. And one of the teenagers leaned over to me and she was like, "Oh, so they're here to sell us." And that, I mean, immediately I was so taken aback and just sad that, you know, that foreigners go into places and some have great intentions. And I never want to act as though I've not made these same mistakes, because I have. But I think just even the language that we're using, people in other countries are smart. They know what these images are going to be used for. I can't tell you how many times I, heard a news story on WhatsApp faster than I did on the actual news outlets, because technology is universal. And if, an organization is posting photos on their Facebook, on their, Instagram, like the subject of that photo, it's highly likely that they will see it. Mm-hmm. And so just being aware of the fact that, one, people have been exploited, and two, need to understand, what are these photos being used for?
Mm-hmm. Although the vocabulary ethical storytelling may be new, ethics in photography community have been around for some time. In fact, I'm reminded of the 1990 story of Kevin Carter.
I mean, this could be possibly a little triggering for some, but I think this story is really very eye-opening. There was a photographer who was in Sudan in the 90s. His name's Kevin Carter, for the New York Times. And he was reporting on, I believe, the war that was happening at the time. And there was this, I was actually reading about it today. And for so long, people thought it was a little girl. I think came to find out it was actually a little boy. But Kevin was photographing this child, and who was just completely emaciated, kind of hunched over on the ground. And there was a vulture approaching the child. Mm-hmm. And so he captured that image, and he went on to win the Pulitzer Prize for it. And not too long after, he committed suicide, because he was so upset and devastated that he had essentially put his craft and kind of the clout of that image above actually helping the child. And so I think that's so sad, but such a good example of, kind of that tension between creating images for impact, but also still upholding the dignity of the human being that you're photographing.
Yes, the constant challenge of mindfulness when it comes not just to storytelling, but to relations in general. When we relate this to our current day organizations or mission, what advice would you give to someone who might agree with what you're saying, but also has to present it to their board and donors as a new way to fundraise, since this more exploitive version of fundraising has really gone on for so long?
I think that first, well, you briefly mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that like vocabulary is constantly changing and ethics are constantly being updated. And so just making sure that, I think it kind of comes back to checking what your intentions are. What are the motives behind this? Is it, if you do have a large donor campaign to raise funds, like how can you do that in a way that still dignifies the beneficiary? Because sure, we could all go to countries that are developing and photograph people who are living in extreme poverty, but at the end of the day, that helps nobody. And so I think just constantly being aware of just the ethics and being, well-trained, and just having a sense of awareness. I think you have to be incredibly sensitive, and your awareness just has to be heightened all the time. And, why am I creating this image? Why am I launching this particular campaign? I heard not too long ago, just kind of even shifting the conversation around photography. Like a lot of times you say, I take a picture, which is true, but think of that verb, like to take. You're taking something from somebody. And so, in this particular context, like you are taking a piece of that person away from them. So how do you want that to be portrayed? You know, I try to be as aware as I can, like not to use the words. I think I said it earlier, but not to use the words like take or capture or shot, because all of those words have different connotations outside of photography.
That's amazing. I never even thought about that.
I mean, I hadn't either until maybe 2 years ago.
Yes, you're right. The vocabulary we use really does have a direct impact on our perception of those around us.
Yeah.
So, as an example, using the word take, as you mentioned, I would love to close out this conversation by knowing one thing that you'd want listeners to take with them today from this conversation. But before we do that, let us know how we can get into contact with you and also what types of services you provide.
Yes, I can be found at laurenneal.com, Neal, and on social media at Lauren Neal. I currently am a full-time freelance photographer who specializes in portraiture. And when I'm able to travel internationally, that really inspires my creativity. So I love working with like-minded nonprofits and organizations. But yeah, I think just the biggest piece of advice that I would want listeners to take away is to, ask yourself, like, why do I have my camera out? What is my end goal? And how is this going to either dignify or degrade the subject? Because, again, at the end of the day, we all have access to photo making technology. And so I just feel very passionate that we need to be responsible and good stewards of these stories that we hear and how we choose to tell them.
Yes, I love that you summed it up with the phrase dignity or degrade, as well as the 4 C's: cultural understanding and awareness, consent, compensation, and community. Thank you so much for taking the time to educate us on the ethical storytelling and also sharing your personal story as well, Lauren.
Thank you for having me.
We know you're busy, so we appreciate you giving us the gift of your time by joining us today. You can get in touch with Lauren and find her at laurenneal.com. That's LAURENNEL.com. Be sure to follow us on Instagram and Facebook at The Point Foundation, spelled Point, POINTE, or visit us online at lapointe.life. Until next time, keep on fighting for justice.